In this video, I'd like to talk about some of the manual metalworking tools that we have down here in the lower shop. First off, we have a couple of different types of shears. And that word, you've heard that word before, I'm sure. It has to do with a type of cutting. Sometimes you can talk about fabric shears. It basically means scissors. It's two blades that are passing by one another. Now, down here in the metal shop, we have a couple of different kinds of shears. We also have a machine that's called a shear, a brake, and a sliproll. It's a combination shear, brake, and sliproll, which we'll talk about in a minute. Those words refer to cutting, the shear, bending, which is the brake, and sliproll obviously means putting a roll on something, or a curve, or a curl on something. Now, all of these shears are clearly labeled with their maximum capacity. What this means is that you can't cut any metal that's thicker than what it says on the label. Now, this shear here, which is our 8-inch bench shear, it will cut up to 11 gauge steel. Okay, what does that mean? I can't ever remember what 11 gauge steel is. Well, that's why we have this nifty little thickness gauge hanging on the wall over here. On it are all the different thicknesses, and then it has these notches. And so what you can do is you can look for the smallest notch that that piece of metal fits into. So this one will fit into the 1/8 inch slot, but it will not fit into the 14 gauge. This shear will do 11 gauge steel, and anything from 11 gauge thinner, all right? Now on here, I would bet that an 1/8 inch is 12 gauge steel. This plate that I have right here fits into the 1/8 inch steel notch, but it's a little loose. So that means it's even a little bit smaller. So it doesn't fit in the 14 gauge very well, and never force it into this. If you can't fit it in there easily, that's not the right size, right? Because you'll bend this and this will be pointless. But what that tells me is that I can cut this piece of steel on this shear, right? Steel is probably the hardest thing you would be cutting down here. You're not going to be working with anything that's much harder than that. Everything else that you might be cutting would be softer. Brass is softer, copper is softer. Steel is the most common thing that you're going to be using. Now, I want to demonstrate this shear because it does have this nifty little device here. And what you'll notice the first time you go, first of all, it's called the 8-inch bench shear because it'll cut something that is up to 8 inches wide. That's pretty great. That's a pretty long cut for metalworking. But what you'll notice is when you put your piece of steel in this and you go to pull it, see what happens? It pushes up on the piece of metal. So you can just hold it in place, but you can also lower this little turn knob and that will support it. And then you can go ahead and make your cut. So I'm going to cut a little sliver off of this to show you what it does, and then I'll show you in close-up too. I will say it's very satisfying. So there you go. Now something to note, because that was so thin and I applied so much force, it automatically put a curve on it. Now I could go to the trouble of flattening this back out, but it'll never be perfectly flat. So know that that's going to happen. And if you need a little skinny piece like this and you need it to stay perfectly flat, best to cut it on something different. This little shear here is called the 4-inch throatless shear. This is very similar to a pair of aviation snips. It's sort of like a really heavy-duty pair of aviation snips. So what that means, what's good about this shear, is that it's bolted to the table. You can hold your piece of metal with one hand and you can cut with the other, and as you're cutting, you can turn that piece of metal to actually get some curved and scrolled cuts. Now, before I do this, I want to point something out. This is an old piece of steel, and it's been painted on and welded on a little bit, but it's still pretty easy to tell that it's steel. Underneath, it has that sort of metallic gray color that steel usually has. There's even a little bit of rust built up on the edge, and if I took a magnet and stuck it to this, it would stick, no problem, right? So that's one of the ways that I know that it's steel. This is a piece of galvanized. You can see that it has this sort of reflective quality to it. This is fine if you're going to be doing handiwork and not welding or cutting with the torch. You could put rivets in this. You can use it on any of the shears, any of the cold working tools. You can use this. You could even use this with the spot welder, I believe. However, I would not use this with any of the welders or with the torch. When you cut galvanized steel or weld galvanized steel, it has a funny reaction and it creates very noxious fumes. So I would not try to use this with any fire. I stopped to put on one glove. Obviously, metal can get very sharp and cut you. Normally I would wear 2 gloves, but I need a hand to start and stop the camera. So I'm just wearing 1 glove, which is what I'm going to hold my metal with here. So let's see if we can make a little scrolled cut on the throatless shear. So I'm cutting very slowly. I'm pulling the handle very slowly, and I'm turning as I cut. There is some resistance. And this is a tool that you can try it and see what gives. And if you don't get exactly the kind of cut that you're hoping for, the plasma cutter might be a better option. The throatless shear has a 14 gauge maximum. So that's a little skinnier, that's a little thinner than the bench shear. In fact, this might be the shear that has the smallest capacity, right? It doesn't do very thick steel. So don't roll up on this with a piece of 1/8" steel and think that you're just gonna cut right through it. You'll just ruin the shear. And then we have to take it all apart and sharpen it, and it still might not be any good. What you see over my right shoulder here is our manual iron worker. In terms of shears, this thing's a monster. It can cut through solid steel. Round stock, 5/8 of an inch. That means a solid round rod can be 5/8 of an inch thick. The main blade shear can cut up to 5/16 of an inch thick. That's a little bit thicker than 1/4 of an inch thick. Square stock, solid, 3/4 of an inch, and angle stock up to 1/4 inch thick. And that means if it's 1/4 inch thick and it fits in the machine, you can cut it. Now, that's why the thing has such a big handle. It's all about leverage. So here I have a scrap piece of steel rod, and I'm gonna guess that it's about 3/8 of an inch thick, right? It's not hollow, it's a solid rod. Put it in the round hole and pull down on the handle. And it cuts right through it. Now, this will cut hollow pipe, but it might flatten it a little bit. So as you can see, it's squished to the end, right? It's not round anymore. So it's not the greatest way to cut something that's hollow. It will cut angle iron really well. Here's a piece of angle iron, probably 1/8 inch thick. You can see this, it'll also cut T-bar. But put that in the 90-degree spot. Cuts right through it. Now, you have to be careful. If it ends up at a little bit of an angle, it won't give you a perfect 90. It also flares it a little bit. If you look closely here, you can see that that's not straight anymore. It flares up a little. So it does warp the stock a tiny bit when you cut it. This is good for making quick cuts, but if you were making something that you wanted really fine details, you might want to cut this stuff on the bandsaw or the abrasive cutoff saw, which I'll show in a different video. This is our Eastwood combination shear, brake, and slip roll. Now you'll notice on the label on this machine that its maximum gauge is 20 gauge steel. That's pretty thin. If you look at the thickness gauge, it is the 3rd thinnest notch. So this is not made for cutting very thick steel. It's made to cut fairly thin stock. Now the nice thing about it is it's 30 inches wide. So you can cut stuff that's thin but super wide. Now the other thing that it does is it'll roll that, or it'll also put a brake on it. You can make an angle. So let me show you how that works really quick and where those options are on the machine. I'll put my other glove on for this. So here's a piece of very flimsy flashing. It would do a little bit thicker piece than this, but I'm just going to use this to demonstrate. Now, this is a bit wider than 30 inches, so I'm going to trim it a little. Trim that end off. Now, if I was really being particular and I wanted a perfect 90-degree angle, I would draw it on the piece of steel. This is the blade right here, so I know exactly where it's going to cut. And this really only has one operating function, which is to spin this. It'll spin either direction. It kind of works the same. No matter which way you go, the blade goes up and down, the brake goes up and down, and the roller spins. So that just cut that right off. And go get it back up in the air. Now it fits. So let's cut a long, narrow piece. So there, I just cut that little strip right off, nice and straight, perfectly straight line, 30 inches long. Now, let me show you what happens when I put it in the brake. The brake is here. This is the brake. This blade comes down, and there is a little trough that it rests in that is a 90-degree angle, sitting like that. And so as this blade, which has a wedge on the end, comes down, it just folds it. If you push it all the way, it'll go to 90 and a little bit more. Now I have a corner piece. Very handy. This thing is so much fun. Now the last thing I'll show you is the slip roll. By the way, flashing is very cheap. You can buy this in the roofing aisle at any hardware store like Lowe's or Home Depot. You can get a whole roll of it pretty cheap. It's fun to play with. You can use it for pop rivets, and I believe the spot welder will weld it together too. So I have this little rectangle that I just cut. Now, watch what happens when I put it through the roller. By the way, the roller for this is in kind of a secret location. It's up here. So you gotta lift the cover off. Sometimes you have to fiddle with this a little bit. It won't go right in the first time. So I have to sort of like back it up and put it in a couple of times until it works. But once it works, you know it's working. And then the way this goes is, you roll it once, you're gonna get a certain curve. If you roll it back and forth a couple of times, that curve will get tighter and tighter. Now I did a funny thing. It made a little scallop. So it might be out of adjustment. I might need to loosen this a little bit. Let's try the other end. That's better. Now it's not doing much of anything. Try it again. You get the idea. Starting to get a little curve on my piece of steel there. This is something that you will want to fiddle with. You can change the adjustment on these two turn screws at either end to tighten or loosen the rollers, depending on the thickness of the steel you're using. Best to have a piece of scrap to test everything on before you go using your workpiece. And that really goes for any tool in the shop. If you're unsure, if you haven't used a tool very often, test everything on a piece of scrap. hopefully it's a piece of scrap that's the same as the workpiece you're using so that you know how the tool is going to react. Two more things about this machine that are really cool. The roller will also do rod. There is a couple little grooves here at the one end, and those grooves are for round metal stock. So you can take something like this, you can run that through the roller. You got to pick the right notch. So again, just like the thickness gauge, you pick the notch that's the smallest. So I'm starting to get a nice curve on that steel rod. And if I run it through again and tighten everything up a little bit, it'll start to get even more curly. So the more times you run it through, the tighter you make it, the more of a curve you'll get on it. Last thing I'll mention about this is the plate for the brake has these panels. And you'll notice a set of lines and bolts. What this can do is it can make boxes. Now, you can't ever make a box that is deeper than the height of this plate, but you could make some really nice steel boxes with this. What you would have to do is take out some of the plates. And what that allows for you to do is, if you think about when you fold up a box, you would fold two sides, then you'd have to fold the other side into it. And at that moment, you have everything coming together, and it would bump the brake if it were just a solid blade. So you'd have to take out and manipulate this almost like leaving gaps, right? And what you would want to do is choose the panel in the brake that was as close to the dimension of your box as possible. I'll do a video later that's a more in-depth use of this, and we'll make a box like that, and I'll show you what it looks like.